Coming up, while the Brooklyn Nets continue to build towards the rebuilding season, we take a look now at Cam Johnson. Plenty of buzz from the Lakers to the Spurs, the Kings. Everybody wants a piece of Cam Johnson, but who makes the most sense from a trade partner standpoint? We break it all down coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Armbrecht. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. All summer long, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every single day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And Doug, all summer long, there's deals to be made for the Brooklyn Nets when it comes to some of the veterans on this team. We talked about Dorian Finney-Smith the other day. He hasn't been traded yet. Now we're going to talk about Cam Johnson. Plenty of trades. Hasn't happened yet, but it feels like the league really wants to help the Brooklyn Nets out.
It does feel like there's probably still moves to be done here. Sometimes we get into a little bit of a dead zone in the NBA offseason where things just kind of grind down to a halt. But I mean, there's still some free agents kind of sitting out there. There's teams that clearly aren't the final versions of themselves. And I do think maybe more than other years, we could be looking at like some August deals. And again, like this doesn't really happen. I think there's a couple of dominoes people are waiting to fall, like Lauri Markkanen and some other stuff that kind of like they want to see how it ends up shaking out before. I do have a feeling when that maybe is decided, like that there is going to be a cascading effect for some of these other guys. Like it's going to go like Markkanen, then Brandon Ingram, and then like the Blazers have already signaled that like Jeremy Grant and Anthony Simons they want to trade them before the season. I think actually, and not to bury the Cam Johnson lead, but he fits in here. I do think there's this world where the league is kind of waiting to see how other things shake out. And then when those pieces are set, then they can kind of like go forward with a Cam Johnson, with a Dorian Finney-Smith trade. I think like that's just, obviously not sourced, but that's my take on this situation, that there's still a lot of guys out there that teams kind of don't want to go into the season with maybe, but nobody's willing to fully pull the trigger because there's other teams that like, right. It's like it's sort of like this weird web that's been woven. And I think Cameron Johnson and Dorian Finney-Smith sort of fall into that. Maybe CJ more than DFS, honestly.
Yeah, and I think, as we talk about these particular players and teams that might be interested, when you mention a Markkanen or even a Grant in Portland, there is obviously a hierarchy, right? Most desirable players, what it means for a team that's going to trade for them, the impact that it has on their roster. But the other side of it is, if there are 6, 7, 8 teams that are all thinking about making a big move like this for a player of that caliber, and they miss out, or the price point is too high, then you start to look into what are the second tier kind of players, and whether or not Dorian Finney-Smith even falls a little bit further down. Like I think Cameron Johnson offers, whether or not Nets fans didn't love what they got from him on the court in Brooklyn, offers the type of player that a lot of high-end teams, deep playoff run teams, maybe championship level teams would look at and say, oh, we can go make a move for him. And when you mention a player like Jeremy Grant, I think that's like one of the great maybe contrasts about what do their contracts look like? How much is it going to cost to get one of these players in on our roster, and teams doing that evaluation. But you still need to see where Markkanen goes. And then I think Ingram is like the next highest player out there on the theoretical trade market right now. You go, where are they going to land and what is it going to cost? Because it is going to recalibrate how much the Nets think they can get for Cam Johnson on the market and how many teams still have assets to put on the table to go get a player like that too.
Yeah, and this and just to add to this, like this NBA, and we'll get to some of these like teams that I think will probably be interested, or are probably interested on some level, but just on a high level NBA wise, I think one other problem that is probably adversely affecting the Cam Johnson and Dorian Finney-Smith markets, such as they are, which I'm not even sure what like sort of how robust they are. One of the things I think is probably happening too is a look around the league and seeing where guys like sort of in their similar age ranges, or even maybe, younger than DFS, are signing free agent deals, and they're so low. Like Gary Trent Jr. signs on like a vet minimum in the Bucks, like a prove it deal with the Bucks. Tyus Jones signs a prove it deal in Phoenix which is like one of the best free agent all season like signings like kind of like ever, honestly, like what they got him for and what they needed. And so all of a sudden you look at these other guys, these free agents who have like real NBA talent, right? Maybe commiserate with the guys the Nets have too at different positions, obviously. But I mean, like if you're just talking in terms of like real NBA rotation guys, and now you're seeing these guys signing for veteran minimums, and you got Cam Johnson who's making money in the 20s, and DFS who's coming off the books but making money in the teens. And I think those contracts look fine still, but the market's so weird now with this new CBA where it does feel like sort of like the middle class vet just cratered on their value. And now I wonder if you have these teams looking at this and being like, look, and not to say that Trent and Tyus are comps. Again, I'm not really comparing them, but sort of like age-wise they are. And if you're like, hey, can we really be trading assets for guys like when these other dudes are just sitting in the free agent market, even if they don't exist in this free agent market? Can we really tie ourselves to this? Because these guys might be available in the next free agent market. And you really want to be sending out assets to bring them in. So I do wonder if there's like this whole sort of like reshifting of the league and everyone's trying to make sense of it. And that for sure does not help the value for these guys. And I wonder if that's a problem too.
Yeah, specifically with Johnson, you think about the Nets and saying, as we know, whatever we're going to do here, money's going to have to go out, money's going to have to come back in. And you need that money for the salary floor. So there's this weird world where having Cam Johnson in the 20s is good for that baseline. And you talk about other teams. Excuse me, I've mentioned this before when it comes to where teams value veterans and experience. We go back to like the Kevin Durant iteration of the Brooklyn Nets. We're going to bring in all these veterans around our superstar talent. But sometimes young players, you're just as well to have them and have low cost and see what's capable. So combining it with guys taking these surprisingly low cost signings in the offseason and then maybe reevaluations for other teams. We're going to talk about the Lakers, talk about the Spurs. If there's young, low 20s to mid 20s players making not that much money that maybe have some sample size that they could grow into a role for a team, you're also doing that equation as well. So I wonder if, unlike Dorian Finney-Smith, when we talked about him and just north of 14 million, have the player option the next year, maybe the extra 7-8 million that Cam Johnson brings in on the books not only complicates matching salaries, but also makes teams rethink where is the best value if we're going to make a move like this. And Cam Johnson clearly does not get up to that next echelon of player that you might make a bigger move for on the trade market. Coming up here in a second, though. It doesn't mean that there aren't teams that we think should trade with the Brooklyn Nets for Cam Johnson. We'll evaluate the best fits and the interesting situations that compare a team like the Lakers and the San Antonio Spurs, opposite ends of the spectrum, but could still find value in Johnson. We'll dive into that in just one moment.
All right, but before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. Look, you love sports. We love them so much. We never want them to stop. During the summer, it can feel like things slow down a little bit. Nah, FanDuel's got you covered all summer long. They got MLB action, obviously rolling here all through the summer months. Oh, the Olympics, ever heard of them? They got those up there as well. If you get on this in time here, you can get old friend Kevin Durant at plus 15 points. I mean, it felt like he could have scored 1 million the other night if he was able to just stay on if he was able to just get a few more minutes. Felt like he was never going to miss. Maybe you want to throw that in with some LeBron James plus KD stuff over there on FanDuel. It's all there for you. It's all summer long. They're hooking you up, all customers, with a booster bonus that's daily. There's something for everyone. Head on over to FanDuel.com. Start making the most of your summer. MLB and Olympics. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball.
All right, so as we roll on today's Locked On Nets episode, talking about Cam Johnson, trade value, and the shifting landscape for the NBA when it comes to the new CBA. It is interesting when you hear the Lakers, the Kings, we've heard the Spurs get thrown in, even the Cavs have been thrown in. Like, there's a laundry list of teams that get thrown out that would be interested in Cameron Johnson. But then when you think about specific price points and how you make a deal like this work, starting with a team like the Lakers, just because they are a team that is still in the win now window. It's LeBron James. It's Anthony Davis. They want to get this done. The hardest part to me is it's easy to look over at their roster and say, or at least for me, hey, Jalen Hood-Schifino, that young player, making a little bit of money, worth the flyer, fits the Nets and what they're doing right now. We'll take him. Now, the only problem is we also have to go ahead and get salary that's going to match this. And we've seen some deals get thrown out when they talk about like a Rui Hachimura, who's making $17 million over the next 2 seasons. That's all well and good, but I think this is the first example of, if you're the Lakers, looking at it and saying, so what exactly are we doing here? because we're giving up a young player that hasn't proven anything yet. But Hachimura actually has looked pretty good for us after coming over from the Wizards. He's not maybe the ideal player, but now we are giving out value. We're giving out real value, and you wouldn't be shocked to hear the Brooklyn Nets at the trade deadline fielding offers for flipping, Rui and getting in more assets down the road. This is the first one where you can understand, and we said this before this offseason, it's not easy to just point a team that could use Cam Johnson and then make the deal that makes sense for the Lakers.
Yeah, the risk of just being like a total broken record on this. We've been through this many times. Every time this, and I, the subject is still worth exploring because the guys are still on the team, but the problems are still worth exploring also, especially if this is the first time you listen to the podcast, which is that great. You want to trade them, go find the trades that work. Go find the trades that work with these teams that are going to be willing to send the player back and maybe an asset or maybe not. Because, let's say it's okay, Cam Johnson for Rui Hachimura. Let's say that the Lakers thought that was an upgrade. Well, why would the Nets do it? You know what I mean? I just don't, unless you thought you could flip Rui at some other point, which would probably be less than you could flip Cam Johnson for. So it's it just doesn't really make sense about why some of these teams, frankly, why either team would do it.
And by the way, just real quick, that Hachimura and Jalen Hood-Schifino, that doesn't get the money all the way there. You still got to add in another $2.7 to $3 million to make the money work. And then the Lakers, just to the point, they're going to sit there and say, we're not attaching and draft assets. Get out of here, right? We're adding in now more and more players that the Nets will, of course, in theory, turn into value down the road.
Right, exactly. So it's just why would the Lakers do it? And then the Lakers well, maybe Jeremy Grant's a better fit. So let's just pile all our assets together and try to get him, right? And so and we'll just figure it out that way because he's just just a better overall fit for what we're trying to do. And so with the Lakers, it becomes a problem, right? With the Cavs, we talked about how that's a problem. It was a little easier with the DFS Okoro sign and trade because the money just matches a little bit better there. Otherwise, what are the Cavs sending back to make the money work? It's doesn't really fit. Kings had some guys on the books that were going to make it work. They traded some of those guys when they brought in, when they ended up getting DeRozan, and they did another deal. What was the other deal they did? They sent out Vezenkov. I can't remember, but anyway, they sent off Harrison Barnes and right, with my getting confused here. I know they sent out Sasha, but anyway, it doesn't matter. A couple of the guys. Sorry, I'm getting my brain's getting a little fried on their moves. Anyway, for sure, they lost a little bit of the powder. Their powder went a little less dry there when they made the moves before, a month ago. And then you get the Spurs, and the Spurs are interesting, right? Because they have Keldon Johnson, and he gets moved to the bench last year. Is not starting. It's unclear how they sort of feel about him. That one's close with the money. If they saw them as just a 1-for-1 swap, does that get it done? I mean, that's maybe the closest to realistic because of the money. And you still have to think is that really a good enough value for Keldon Johnson? I'm not really sure. And so just Cameron Johnson back. So I just don't know. It's become this, and I honestly think this is the biggest part of the problem. I think there's teams that want Cam. I think it's Nets fans want to drag this guy hard, and he had a really rough season. There's teams that would for sure add him. It's more the logistics than the player, I think. That's where I stand on it. I mean, but maybe we can explore the Keldon Johnson thing a little bit deeper.
Jalen McDaniels, they brought in Sacramento when they sent out those couple of players there that moved some of the salary off for them over the course of the summer as well. For the Kings.
I picture myself. This is going to derail the podcast. But I can picture myself where I was sitting when I was going through all the King stuff, and I was just I was actually sitting in a beach chair and I was going through it, and I was oh, okay, here we go. But then I just I simply couldn't remember who was involved with the deals. So I remember I can place myself historically where I was in the moment of kind of seeing how some of this stuff was going down, and then when it came to actually in the moment remembering it, it looked like a total donkey. So anyway, sorry, go ahead.
No, listen, donkeys are a friend of the show as well. I agree with you on the Lakers stuff and on the value of Cam Johnson. The teams are out there that want to have him. And I really, unlike with Dorian Finney-Smith, who with his age and the player option is there, it just, to me, as we said also at length on this show, it behooves the Nets to make a move with him and just clear him off the roster. You also look at the front court and you see some players and you have young talent and guys that you've brought in, and you think about the season ahead and just wanting to have that minute share cleared out. The Cameron Johnson one is interesting to me, and it does go back to something that you and I mentioned going back a month now, and then kind of realized or accepted that the offseason is long and there was still months to go before we got to October. So when we said, do we think Cam Johnson will get traded? Like, probably not. Wouldn't be shocked if they go into regular season with him. I backed off of the idea a little bit just because of how much time there was. And it's easy to forget that deals can continue to slowly roll in throughout the summer. That being said, out of the two, I still look at Cam Johnson and from a Brooklyn perspective and say, this is a situation where if we don't feel like we're getting true value, quote unquote, on Cam Johnson in a trade, and that can be in the form of picks or in the form of young players or in the form of contracts that are going to make sense as a baseline next year. If we don't get some combination of that value, we'll go into the regular season with him on the roster. Like, I still think that is on the table, even if what the Nets are trying to do is to move all these veterans off the books. It will be interesting to see how these other deals unfold, because if they're low enough, we talk about a Jeremy Grant, or if the packages don't quite meet a certain threshold, we know that Sean Marks has been of the mindset to not just give away assets for nothing. That's still what's going on with Dorian Finney-Smith right now, and that's only starting to maybe evolve when we hear Cleveland sign and trade a young player, controlled asset. That's the only thing that's starting to move the needle there. Not all these other teams can offer that same level of player to intrigue Brooklyn. So it is a two-way street. It's not just what do other teams want to give up and how do they look at those trade packages. We know that Sean Marks is going to look at the assets and say, I still believe there's value. And he has some samples in his back pocket that say, sometimes when I play the waiting game, it does pay off for me.
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes you waited too long, by the way.
And then other times it doesn't work out, right?
And it's gotten weird. And by the way, just to rehash on one thing I said before, Harrison Barnes got traded to the Spurs when they were pulling off the sign and trade with the Bulls, I believe. So so just to say the Barnes anyway, I'm just going back to that with the Kings only because the Barnes money was going to probably help some too if you were looking to match salary on the way out. But that was the other one that I was like, oh, I knew another guy that was going to help facilitate something got taken off, and that it was Barnes in that other trade. I do think that from like a logistical perspective, when it comes to Marks and these trades, if I had to guess and bet right now, my guess is Dorian Finney-Smith just gets moved, and it's just like kind of just like maybe for whatever at this point, and Cameron Johnson's still on the team. That's my guess. Like that's my hunch. I can go through why I think that's the case, but if July 31st here, having to put a bet in about what I think ends up happening, that's my guess is like DFS is gone because of sort of like this inherent injury risk and diminishing. I just like don't see a world where during the season his value increases, right? I think with Cameron Johnson, because of the way that the contract is structured, right, over the next 3 seasons, especially next year where it like goes down money, I think you could go the whole year with him on the team and feel okay about it because like the money gets less next year. Like he goes from 23 this year to 21 next year. And I think at that point, like you're still probably in a value zone, and he could play his way back to like higher. Like he could actually play his way back into like better value. So I think that like that's probably where I land. And I think if you just look at how they structured the salary, which was the decrease next year where the Nets were like they specifically did it because they're trying to maximize cap space if they had kept McHale. By doing that, they may have opened the door to make him an even better trade guy for next season, right? And so that's kind of where I land on that.
Coming up here in a second, a footnote about the Sacramento Kings and why they still are in a position to come in with an offer for the Brooklyn Nets that would make sense for both sides. Also, an Eastern Conference team in the Orlando Magic who seem destined to push themselves into that playoff deep run conversation. We'll close out on that and some Olympic chatter around one Dennis Schroeder, all coming up next. All right, so as we wrap up today's Locked On Nets episode, looking at the possibilities of where Cam Johnson could go, and then ultimately, as Doug mentioned, whether or not we think he is a candidate to still be here going into the season. We'll have Doug expand on his thoughts around that in just 1 second, but noteworthy that you still do have a player like Kevin Huerter on the Sacramento Kings. If you go and just look at those salaries and swap them over, they work. They still have enough room underneath their cap, even after the moves that they've made, to bring in the 16.8 to Brooklyn, to take the 23.6 over to Sacramento. And then you could talk about maybe adding in a draft asset of some kind. And don't even worry about young players, et cetera. And this might be the different version of the Nets going out here and bringing in a lot of young, sometimes reclamation projects, some got established talent, as we talked about with the prospect of the Cavs trade. Here would just be, hey, this is a guy in Herder that still puts some money on your books, 2 years left on his deal. That makes sense. And then what can we get out of you from a draft standpoint? So the Kings are still an interesting, I think, trade partner, maybe one of the better ones because of where they are in their timeline. They make the deal for DeRozan. Like, they are giving you we want to go and win now. We want to be in that Western Conference conversation. And that matters a little bit here too. When you think about the hierarchy of where teams finished last year and maybe expectations and also what their window is, that's the one caveat in all of this, which Doug
You're right.
probably doesn't appreciate, just, and I don't mean this negatively, because it's abstract, but it's desperation, right? Teams that are a little bit desperate and that feel like they want to accomplish something now are going to be willing to go the extra mile. The New York Knicks, they wanted to get Mikal Bridges. They wanted him to be there with his boys, and they feel like they're on the precipice of making their big push. A couple teams like that, and then all of a sudden, these trade conversations dial up in a way that get pretty exciting from a Nets perspective.
Yeah, the counterpoint to that, I would say, I agree with you that it's hard to sometimes evaluate and analyze the exact number around we have to win now. Yeah. I do think the counterpoint to that is Cameron Johnson and DFS aren't those guys. Mikal might be that guy, right?
No,
in terms of massive
Ingram might be that guy. You got to have.
I said Meadle Neuver. Yeah, Meadle. It's a Meadle Neuver. Yeah, that's a new one.
Meadle Neuver.
And these guys just aren't on that level, and so it's just not the kind of guys and the contracts that you get desperate for, that you go desperation moves. So I agree with you that sometimes these teams look at it and it's like, hey, we got to do this now. But I'll go back to what I said at the top. This new NBA landscape with some of these contracts, man, it is getting weird time around some of this stuff, especially if you get up there in age. And the CBA has had some down chain effects on how teams sort of view their futures and view the money that they have on the books. And what I think were super solid, great contracts before, I'm just not sure they're exactly the same. And these guys just aren't quite good enough. They're just not good. They're just not good. The Nets probably now overpaid. Does Cam Johnson sign this contract this free agency year? No chance, right? I don't think. And so based on his age and injury history and stuff, I think he got in totally at the right time. DFS, they sign him for this contract right now in 1 year. No chance. Not based on how some of these other teams are, the ones that want to win that have already spent a lot, right? If you're trying to win now and you've already spent a lot, maybe it's different with the Magic and other teams that don't have as much money in the books because they're superstars, even OKC to some degree, because there's some young superstars haven't gotten fully paid yet. It's a little different for those teams, but we don't hear those teams being talked about really in these conversations, and for a reason. So it's just a weird. I think that the NBA landscape has gotten. I don't know if we can use previous off seasons as great comps for this. At least for unless we see I think we need to see 1 or 2 more years of this new CBA sort of play out in this way.
That I was just about to say was we're caught maybe in this in between, this transition period where there's these old contracts for players of a Cam Johnson caliber that don't fit into where the new CBA landscape allows teams to operate, and we're seeing some of those signs this offseason. So teams still have those on the books. Those guys still exist around the league. So until you can clear those numbers, then you can't start to spend maybe $7 to $12 million on a couple of guys each, instead of having it tied up into $20 to $25 million in one individual player. And again, the one thing when it comes to Cam Johnson, and as you mentioned, if we said what we thought was most likely, I agree with you. I agree with you. I think that Dorian Finney-Smith gone, Cameron Johnson still being here wouldn't surprise me. And again, just as a reminder, whatever Cam Johnson is or is not, if you told me that he was on the team going into next season, you need the salary floor, and the Nets aren't in a situation where they can't afford to look at it and say, the guys that are earning the minutes and the players that we want to have as our core going forward are going to play. Cameron Johnson, you may just be a bench veteran for this team at 23 and then $21 million. Okay. That's what your role is here. And whether or not Cam Johnson looks at that and thinks it's the perfect situation for him, it kind of doesn't matter. You got paid just ahead of when the CBA would have kind of shifted your value dramatically lower. And now that's who you are. You're a veteran, experienced player coming off the bench. You're there to help some young players along the way as they grow. That's what it's going to be, because the Nets are still going to need to get to that point. And there'll always be these salary dumps. I will say that's probably the one thing I'll close out on, is that's the other side of value for Brooklyn going into next year, is all the teams that have contracts like this that want to dump them because of the new CBA. The Nets are going to be going, here we go, 2 years left at 20-something million. We'll take a couple of those players because we know we can go ahead and use that value.
Yeah, there's going to be some teams that are caught in the middle here that are going to be forced to sort of have to make some tough decisions and around the money. And like the Zach LaVines of the world. I'm not even sure the Nets would be like even willing to do that, but he's the sort of, again, like the canary in the coal mine for how desperate teams are going to want to get off certain money, and what they'd be willing to attach in an effort to like just have it clear of the books. And that'll be another we didn't see it fully play out. And we didn't have tons of teams that were all the way there yet, because I think some of these teams too, like these tanking teams in the past, kind of see their futures as maybe a little brighter. Like let's say Charlotte, even Detroit, Orlando, that might not be, that just don't want to keep losing. Well, Orlando's hasn't been losing, but Detroit, like they're like, we don't want to be a dumping ground again. Like we've got to start turning this around. We've got some young guys. We need to figure it out, and we want to just start moving forward. The Nets and the Wizards
aren't going to be that team. You wouldn't think, at least, if they're trying to get out from the hole that they've been in. That'd be losing team.
Who's that? The Wizards, you said?
Yeah, like going forward, they got to turn this corner.
They're the two teams. The Wizards and the Nets are the two teams that are going to be like, "Hey, it's cool. Like this is what we're doing. Don't worry about it. And we'll take your trash, and it doesn't need to be treasure." But I do think part of what makes this discussion, and we can kind of start closing it out here, but what makes this discussion, I don't know, sound like a little bit like it's waffling, is that we just aren't clear. This is new territory with how these teams are operating. It's not just set it and forget it. Like these are the guys you trade for. This is what you kind of give up for. There's been some market shifting, crazy stuff. Someone's on the good side. It's like, the Nets got an incredible haul for Mikal Bridges, right? Yeah. And so I'm not sure we see a deal like that again, but I said that after the Gobert trade. So what do I know? And but at the same time, where it's not totally clear that these teams want to go above and beyond for guys, unless they're for sure starting. It's like, hey, Chris Paul come in as a veteran, right? Like with the Spurs, and he signed a lower deal too. Like, you're going to start. Like, let's do Tyus Jones. You're starting. Gary Trent, you're starting at the 2. We'll do it with these guys on really low numbers. Guys like DFS and Cam Johnson that aren't for sure going to be starters. CJ probably would be on most of these teams. I don't know. Like, it's just like, it might be hard to go to your owner and say, hey, we're going to do this. It's not totally clear.
Yeah, no, I think it's 100% true, and it's one of the parts where I've heard John Corrales, Locked On Celtics, talk about the new CBA and the way how restrictive it's become and some of the damages that it does to teams and that landscape. In my mind, I liked it, the idea of balancing things out and having it be that you don't just overstock with 1 or 2 players. It helps spread the money around, helps spread the stars around, really, is what my theory was. But the fallout of that is clearly being seen here right now, where it's like, yeah, great, maybe we will do that. But guess what we're not going to do is be interested necessarily in investing in that mid-tier class of player. And you said it. If you're a team that doesn't have Cam Johnson slated as a starter or as like the missing bench piece for your rotation, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to look at that contract maybe over the next few years and feel confident, especially with his injury history as well, bringing him in. I will just, for the record, Doug, remind everybody that I think the Toronto Raptors might be an interesting trade partner for Cam Johnson. They still have that Bruce Brown money on the books. You get a draft asset. Everybody goes home happy. There you go. I'm official.
Oof, man, digging deep, buddy. Okay.
I did. Doug,
the summer rolls on. We got more to talk about. We're going to talk Jordi Fernandez at the end of the week here. Just how awesome it's been, just sort of again watching him as Team Canada's coach, and the Nets really almost for sure definitely got something here. And so that's been cool. Yeah. We'll do some Olympic roundup as soon as we know how the U.S. Side of the bracket starts to finish off. So we got some more stuff to come at you later in the week. In the meantime, make sure you subscribe to Locked On Nets wherever you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Nets over on YouTube as well.
A factor which noticeably influences a performance. No, it's not a needle mover. It's a needle mover, Doug. And that's care of one Webster's Dictionary.
One of the all-time great poets. We're back in later in the week talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball.